LICRA is a not-for-profit association. This is our 25th year, and I'd say at our peak we had 14,000 members. So in some respects, we're no different than what you've talked about, with the occupancy issues and changes in the marketplace. We've got two issues. One, we can't recruit members if they're not moving in, and then certainly we've got a little bit of an attrition factor, as you know. And so as our membership ages in place, we have something that's very unique in membership organizations. We can't control death, and that's just a real reality for us. Is that we see that, and that's something we track obviously pretty closely. But I think the core is we don't represent 28,000 residents across the state, which is kind of our total pool, if you will. But a pretty good portion, and and pretty much at every facet of the state, we've got some coverage in terms of where our membership and residents are located. 12-member board. It's the largest and oldest resident association in the country. We'll talk about that, and effectively, I'd say in this standpoint, I don't think certainly the founders of the organization had any idea what LICRA would be, or if it would be here 25 years later, but it is, and it continues to grow in the sense that, in our heyday, we had the domino effect where we were literally growing 1,000 members net gain a year during the 90s. We're not seeing that clearly anymore. But what I will stress is we still continue to see growth as new residents move in, a new generation of residents move in and get exposed to the organization, and then certainly other communities where we don't have what we call formal chapters. We're continuing to see growth in probably 2 or 3 communities a year where we get new chapters. I think our biggest claim to fame, and that's, I think, hopefully it's where our partnership comes in with Leading Age on many issues, more things that we agree on than not, is the grassroots impact that the residents have. You see it locally, and we see it. I think from our standpoint, that's really where we try to push. Our efforts is to ensure people are doing candidate forums, either in collaboration with resident councils or on their own accord, but at least they're being done, going to county delegation meetings and testifying. All of those things that keep that first, 2 blocks from here, keeps what a continuing care is at the top of their mind, and that they have a clear understanding of it. Some things I think are just important, because some of you don't have LICRA membership in your communities. It's not obviously in the law, it's not in 651, but by and large, this is another area LICRA's gotten pretty close to focus on, making sure that the residents that are on continuing care advisory council are LICRA members, and we've managed that process primarily to make sure we've got some people that hopefully are articulate and have a bigger picture, and aren't, we haven't been 100% successful, but that they're not coming in with a local agenda, that they're looking at a statewide issues if possible. And so I'd also stress, LICRA, hopefully those of you that have chapters know this because you see it and you live it, we're not there to replace a resident council. And we'll talk about some of those elements in a minute. We say, look, the resident council obviously looking at everything that happens within the 4 walls and the campus. LICRA's looking at everything else that goes outside those 4 walls, and that's really where the break line should be. Steve knows NACRA pretty well, and has been working with the leadership there for a number of years. These effectively, NACRA started in about 1994, and this kind of just gives you an idea. This has kind of gone beyond Florida, and they're at a pivotal moment too, a crossroads, if you will. And I think, based on some of the new leadership coming into this organization, they're going to continue to grow because I think certainly the new leadership, they're actually having board elections next week in Connecticut, very business-minded, and understand that, again, the collaboration that needs to be there between providers and residents, and that the best outcomes are going to be achieved by working together, not against each other. That's a good thing. I would encourage you, I know Brian Rivera probably knows, but nacrau.com is a website I would encourage you to look at, if nothing else, just to see how they're approaching this topic. And they basically are trying to build a Wikipedia, if you will, for continuing care issues, regulators, residents, and providers. And so they continue to load documentation, and ancillary materials on there. And then again, we continue to see from both a Florida perspective and a national perspective, prospective residents going to sites like this to get information and kind of get their feet wet on what questions to ask, what resources are available around the country, depending on what state they're in and things of that nature. So I encourage you just to look at that at your leisure. So I'm going to focus more on the key topics here. You know, some of this you know. So, I mean, I know obviously you live this every day, but I'm just going to give you kind of my perspective, and Mary Ellen's seen it, certainly Jane Gale, is, you know, some things haven't changed, but some things have. And, you know, I would say in this standpoint, the residents today, whether they're a new resident or a resident's been in their facility for 20 years, their mindset's different. For the same reasons, you know, the topics you've talked about, the economic pressures and conditions are on their mind clearly, and their issues of whether or not are they going to outlive their assets. You know, even though most of you got benevolent funds and things of that nature, they're still thinking about those kind of things, and certainly want to make sure that their quality of life is going to be there. And so I'd say, you know, I'd say in most cases residents are really more focused on these things than they ever have been, at least from our perspective. And I don't think there's been a shift in standpoint that you see what I call, you know, more antagonistic attitude, if you will, or what I call more suspect attitude. It's more about two things: that they know what's happening on around them because of the internet, and the retired population, I'll be honest with you, lives and breathes on it, and in some cases they're more savvy than we are, and so they have access to way more information than they ever had before. And that information, you know, in some cases may not be the best information, but if it's what they have to go on, they go from there. And so what I'm trying to stress as we go through this is how you can help, you know, in terms of communication and transparency, to make sure that they're working from the facts and not something that they're just taking something out of context and working from that standpoint. So I think certainly the philosophy that for residents now, and by and large, is trust but verify, meaning they have complete trust. They do not want to do your job, but they do want to make sure and have complete confidence in, you know, the provider in terms of the community that they live in. And as Mary Ellen pointed out, you know, they have, you know, the ability and now the knowledge of where to go get information, and we'll talk about some of that. I think certainly, you know, again, you have to recognize, you know this because of who the people are. Many of them are coming from a very significant business backgrounds in their own accord. These are smart people in many cases. They want to understand the structure, if you will, of what they're living under, and they want to know how the dots connect. And in that standpoint, you know, they don't take things at face value, and it's less about whether they expect, you know, or don't have trust in the issues. They just want to understand how the pieces fit together. And when they feel like they get pushback, that's when questions start to arise, and I'll talk about some of that. Let me go through, Mary Ellen and Jane Gale asked me to give you some focus on the NACRA, and I'll go through this fairly quickly. You know, even though this is a Florida meeting, obviously, I think the point is to share that at a national level, NACRA has a financial soundness committee that's looking at a number of areas, and some of which are on your agenda today. And the point is, you know, NACRA from a visionary standpoint, to be clear, wants to ensure that states control continuing care regulations by and large. They're not advocating for some federal congressional blueprint or model, but their point is that certainly some states either have little or no regulations, or they may have regulations but don't enforce the regulations. They want to make sure that continuing care, the model that they know and love, survives for the next generation. And they believe that the only way that that's going to happen is that other states that maybe have not been as progressive as Florida come in and actually start to do those things to ensure and protect the quality of life and the ability, the financial stability of the market, because they know, you know, one bad press story, if you will, has such a trickle effect across the country, not only in one state but across the board, that, you know, they see some gaps, or at least some rooms for improvement. So again, the collaboration is there with Leading Age nationally, and so Stephen and Larry Minix and his staff are familiar with these components, but just giving you kind of the focus areas. Board governance, looking at model bill of rights that could be developed nationally. Certainly the accounting standards are important to them. Again, for the same reason you talk about, is like how to make it clear and how to get it in a position where people can actually understand what's required and what the standards are. So this is effectively, if you go to nacreu.com, you'll have some reference material you could go to and get a little more detail. But these are the key components. And they're breaking these up into chunks and basically saying, depending on what degree of regulation a state has on a 1 to 10 scale, these are the key components that need to be present. And there's obviously narrative behind each of these subjects to ensure that states are looking at it from somewhat uniform standpoint. I can tell you, clearly as a component of this, they also are, from a policy standpoint, trying to broaden out focus from the National Association of Insurance Commissioners as a medium, if you will, to kind of take some of this coming out of that GAO study from a couple years ago that came forward on continuing care. And I think from a resident standpoint, they feel like that report, there was a lot of work that went into GAO report, and in some cases not many states have actually done anything, not reacted or been proactive on any of the recommendations, especially in those that don't really have good regulations or no regulations in that manner. So all the things that you focus on, and then I would stress this, although it's coming from NACRA as a residents association, it's clearly in collaboration with Leading Age in terms of it's not happening in a vacuum where one group's over here tinkering away and then we say, ta-da, here it is. They're trying to make sure, AVPAL and other people like that have been involved in, communicating with this soundness committee so that they're not just taking a very limited, narrow perspective on what they think's right. They're trying to get the subject matter experts in the various areas to register in on some of these things as they develop a work product, if you will. So that's important for you to know as well. So you can kind of see from the topics what's being covered. And like I said, they're breaking it up into chunks. They know everything's going to, step-by-step process, and because it's a National Association of Residents, certainly not the financial resources that Leading Age has. A lot of this has obviously been done, from a virtual standpoint in the grassroots level to try to move some of these processes forward. But they are beginning to make some pretty good headway, and we're seeing some movement there. So it's important for you to see the key topics that they're focusing on. And these effectively, the Soundness Committee effectively is incorporating from a resident standpoint. Residents have been in facilities 20 or more years, but then also taking in the people who have been in a facility for 1 to 3 years. So coming in with a different perspective in terms of the environment that they moved in, so that they're getting the balance of generational perspectives on some of these topics.
Bennett, these are pretty weighty topics.
Yes.
Now, do they have staff working with them, or do they have the expertise?
Sure. So the question is, Mary Ellen's question was about staff. Effectively, NACRA is a very small not-for-profit, and so they don't have direct staff, if you will, in the sense of an executive director or a lobbyist walking the halls in D.C. They just don't have that resource at this point. What they do have is the same that we have here in FLICRA, is a pretty broad-based group of subject matter experts based on their own career perspective. So it's a very heavily volunteer-driven association right now. They have a blueprint to get to where they want to be, where they have the ability to have paid staff or consultants to focus on some of these things to help move the ball forward. But a lot of the legwork, if you will, is being done by retired CPAs, retired actuaries, other folks like that, people who have been chiefs in some cases in some of the states that are on the subcommittees, CFOs that were CFOs for CCRCs, so people are clear understanding of the topics and know what they're walking into in terms of the, like you said, the kind of significance and the complexity of some of these topics. These are just, it's a work in progress, but our point is to show that nationally, what's taking place. And I would just stress in the standpoint of NACRA as a template here, just for consideration purposes, that NACRA is not any different than FLICRA was 25 years ago. And to some extent, I'm sharing this with you, even though this is a Florida meeting. We're seeing in some cases states, very no different than what we saw with FLICRA. 1 or 2 residents in a particular community have an issue, and they're starting to do research, and then they build a nucleus, and then you start to see some. So we're seeing, probably I'd say in the next 12 months, probably another 6 to 7 state resident associations kind of getting into the game, if you will, which is going to almost double what we have right now in terms of what we call formal state resident associations in the FLICRA template. And so my point in sharing that with you is twofold. One, it's going to have a ripple effect, and wherever we are, but it also is putting us into a position where, especially in the Florida market, depending on where your new residents are moving in from, their exposure to some of these issues is probably going to be more and more pronounced in terms of what information that they might be armed with, if you will, when they come in. Okay. So let me transition more kind of the Florida topics, and they are national too, but I want to talk about, hopefully I've conveyed the why behind maybe some of the questions that you're seeing, maybe that you didn't see 10 years ago, and go through some of the premise behind that. They, especially being in Florida as a sunshine state, the public records issues are there. The internet, obviously, example, Mary Ellen pointed out earlier, it's not uncommon for us, get 5 or 6 calls a week from existing residents and prospective residents asking information of these things. So, like GuideStar.org, for example, being open with you, again, we try to, if it's a local issue, meaning from it stemming from local-based questions, we always try to ensure that they come back to the resident council first, and we'll talk about that. But individually and collectively, residents are using the tools that are available to kind of say, what does our CCRC look like compared to others? Now, from a FLICRA standpoint, we try to convey to them, and your previous presenter's point was well taken, is you've seen one CCRC, you've seen one. And so they have to make sure that you can't necessarily always compare apples to apples, that they've got to really kind of peel the onion back and really determine what things are similar and what things are not. You can't just look at the numbers and say, ta-da, this is what it should look like. Told you. There's more depth that they have to go to make those kind of determinations. But they do have, I guess I'd say a higher focus on operating ratios that are available, executive compensation and management fees. And really they're trying to look at it from the standpoint of, is our money being well spent, and is it going in the right places? And that's really where some of this comes from. And I'd say from a recurring standpoint, some of the topics that come up are, they want to look at third-party vendor relationships and affiliated entities. That's really a big topic for them to ensure that is a reasonable market value being paid in terms of the services provided. And so that's a very common topic amongst residents around this state for sure. The governance now, leading age and FLICRA, we've had a series of task forces, and several of you are on the current task force here today. We put forth effectively what we call a best practice document in terms of if there's a grievance or an issue, if you will, that kind of lays out what we think are the best steps to go through to come to some type of resolution, if you will. Now, governance in general, for really our history from a FLICRA standpoint, we've always had what I call a vocal minority in this state that's advocated for mandated residents serving on a provider board. It's always been there, it hasn't gone away, but the noise is getting louder, if you will, because of what they're seeing on not only here but also around the country. Now, we've always, from a policy standpoint, relied upon the premise that the resident councils are there. They're there for a reason, and that's the entree, if you will, for residents and management to sit down together and talk through issues and find hopefully a common solution. Now, what we're sharing with you just from an overall analysis standpoint is some resident councils are ineffective. And I'm just illustrating the reasons why. They either don't know or understand their role. And I know in your standpoint, you've got to keep somewhat at an arm's length for obvious reasons on those kind of issues. But at the same token, they tend to rely on management for information and maybe some guidance. And so trying to find that balance is extremely important. I can tell you, as it relates to the issues that are important to you from a policy standpoint, meaning legislative policy, where we have what I call ineffective resident councils, that's where problems start. Meaning, if you've got one resident or you've got 10 residents and they're sitting around looking at all this public data and measuring and contrasting information, and then they bring what they believe is an issue that they want the council to address, and they basically get a cold shoulder or say, we're really not going to talk about this, they're not going to stop there. And so, the point that they feel like they're trying to go to what they believe is their appropriate body, being the resident council, to at least discuss something, at least discuss it. Doesn't mean that something's going to happen, but when things just kind of get put to the side, that's where issues happen. And so from a general standpoint, over the years, from a FLICRA board standpoint, we've been able to, for an example, we've had, even 2 or 3 years ago, we had a legislative bill filed from one community, stemming from issues in one community, and that wasn't the only occurrence. We've had other communities in that same position where one group of residents, effectively because of the grassroots relationship they have with legislators, said, our issue's not being addressed. We want you to file a bill or an amendment to do something. In most cases, FLICRA, in collaboration with Leading Age, we've been able to kind of deter that activity from having what I call a small segment of people control the rules and not vet it out. But the point is, if they don't feel like they're getting a resolution locally, they're going to find an external solution of what they think is appropriate. And so my biggest message here is kind of look at how effective your resident council is and make some kind of determination of how are they performing, and are they focusing on the right topics, and if nothing else, convey to them what their regulatory role is, or at least what authority they have, if you will, which is limited within 651 purposes, but to impress upon them that and we know this from a resident standpoint, maybe Joe's kind of like the nag in the community and everybody knows that's he's the guy.
Do you know Joe?
Yeah, but Joe, if he doesn't feel like he's being listened to, he's going to find somebody to listen. And the point is, at some point he's going to find somebody who will listen and potentially will either make a determination that, hey, Joe's got something's going on here, and maybe he's not just blowing smoke. And sometimes that could be a legislator. And so that's my point, is just trying to analyze that and make that kind of analysis in your own accord. The other point is certainly, if they don't feel like they've got open communication with management is an issue, that's important. And then clearly they understand that there's things that sometimes you can't share certain things, and certain levels of information you can't share. I think people respect those. I think the issue happens or are created when they feel like there's no communication, or every question is asked, well, we can't really talk about that, we can't share that with you. At some point they begin to think something else is there, even when there may not be. And so I think that's just important key topic for you in terms of governance, because we have an existing mechanism for resident management collaboration at the local level now. Some places it's very good, some places not so good, and so that's my own point, is to say when there's not an effective structure there, that's where things I think can happen. So as I stressed, we've trying to take the focus that we've always tried to push forth on the volunteer aspects of what's available for resident representation, if you will, including the designated representative. But that pressure, if you will, from the residents, from the ground up, is definitely shifting. And so I'm not telling you today that FLICRA is going to change its policy position. I don't know that. I'm just telling you the pressures, if you will, to look at that is definitely more pronounced than it ever has been. So I think in your packet you've got the New Jersey law, so I won't go into detail on it, but the only thing I would stress here, is whether it's mandatory or whether it's voluntary, and clearly some of you in the room have voluntary residents on your board. The issue is, at least from a topical standpoint, is that your resident council and management's talking about this rather than it coming up just on its own accord. I would tell you, and again, whether it's the mandatory or voluntary, I understand where the arguments come from, where the discussion whether a resident being on a board is a conflict of interest. Understand the argument, and the rationale behind that. What I'm also sharing with you is the residents really don't buy into that, and because I think they recognize that, and I've been in these discussions with residents, either in places where they didn't have one before and now they have one, that they have a clear picture that if they're on that board, they're a board member. Just they happen to be a resident, but that if they're on that board, that's how they're going to convey their actions and what perspective they're going to come from, just like any other board member should. So because of that, and because of the demographics of the people that are populating these resident seats, many of which were business people, that's where I say that it can't be just based on we're not going to do this because it's a conflict. There have to be something else behind it, and there are other arguments, if you will. But I will tell you, again, I'm just looking at from a trickle-down effect. As other states look at this in terms of addressing this some way in statute, it will be more and more difficult, I think, for Florida. I'm not saying when, but I just think the pressure will be there for Florida to at least talk about what is a different way Florida could address this, if there is a different way. And it comes down to having a seat at the table. And they don't, I think, again, I stress it's more about access to information, access to understanding, and having context for the decisions by which the community is being operated. They don't want to control or second guess what's taking place, but they just want to have a clarity of why things are taking place in the manner that they are. That's really what it comes down to in most cases. The task force, I know you've got a closing panel on that today, or I had a little bit this morning too. I would just stress for you one topic that our task force will be talking about at the end of this month is within the discussion areas here. As part of this current task force, we took effectively market examination reports from the various communities, and quite frankly, we hadn't done it actually ever from a collective standpoint, a comprehensive standpoint. And we'll certainly, I know Lady Edwards will share this with you in the full context of the data. But the point here I would stress is 25% of the licensed CCRCs fail to comply with certain disclosure provisions. Now, one could argue, and it would include me too, is some of the disclosure provisions are fairly new, meaning they happened with our last iteration of 651 revisions that stemmed from a recent task force that we had. And so these market examination reports, in many cases, at least the violations, if you will, where OIR found a citation there, if you will, most of those were related to new disclosure provisions. So you could say, well, it's a new window. It's our first cycle of having to do these things. So you could argue that may have been one of the reasons behind it. And I think that probably would be pretty accurate. The point is, though, these disclosure provisions were intended to ensure that people had, the residents, primarily the resident council president, and who could pass it down the line, had a more frequent access to certain types of information, and so that it's there. And the fact that in some cases it wasn't done at all, my only point there is whether it's done or not, and I don't think it, in many cases it is done from a malicious standpoint. It's an issue of, I forgot it was on the checklist type of issue. In those places where there's an ineffective resident council, and in those places where there's maybe a small vocal minority that think something's going on, and then they go to these kind of reports and say, told you, they're trying to hide something, they're not even disclosing what's the laws. You could see where my point is that they start to begin, they may say, this is a precedent here, there's something going on. And so all I'm saying is don't let a paperwork issue become a bigger issue. And that's what I would say there. Sorry. I think what I would stress to you as a group, and I'm very appreciative to have the opportunity to talk with you today, is, the best thing I think that's ever happened is the ability for us to have a joint task forces. And we recognize some of these, especially the current task force's charge is pretty complex. And we have no preconceived notion that the solutions are going to be easy. In some cases, we may not have a solution. But the point is, the ability to have that open dialogue makes a world of difference. And so my only point is, at the local level, ensure those types of practices are there as much as they can be. And I think certainly we respect everybody has different business models, for-profit, not-for-profit, and every business model and structure in between. So it's, we understand that. But I think when and if possible, where there can be open dialogue between residents and providers, it's better. Well, I think the outcomes are better, just because of the things I've kind of stressed to you. Residents want that information, and when they feel like they either don't have access to that information or feel like they're getting kind of like a stone wall, it creates in their mind, something that may not be there, and that's that. And so I think when they feel like they've gone to the well over and over and they keep getting a no answer or something like that, then they will go to other places. And our point is they should do that at the local level, when and if all possible. So I hope I've maybe just stressed some of what I think are kind of the mindset of the current resident population, if you will, from a collective standpoint, and then what they're looking for. I mean, certainly, if we look at it from I call it from a civic standpoint, their main objective, I think, from what I see, is they want to make sure the continuing care model survives, and that's the bottom line. Is they feel like, to be frank with you, the continuing care model is not generating enough of the next generation coming in at the pace that they believe it should, based on the quality of life that they enjoy, and the continuing care model and what it brings to their population. They want to see that move forward in a very positive way, and I think they just are concerned that things are, some of which are out of our control, but certainly those things we can control from a marketplace standpoint, that we should ensure that the press that we get, if you will, is the right kind, and that's really where they come into play. So I'm happy to take any questions that you might have, or no one take it personal. I'm not shy about answering. So yes, sir.
Bennett, I think that one of the slides, I think.
Yeah, that's one got cut off. So
that one I think is relevant to the group.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that. I couldn't do it by memory, so thank you. So a couple of slides I didn't get to, so let me just kind of focus on these. Be involved on the front end discussions when expansions are being considered. And I think nobody likes a surprise unless it's your birthday. So I think if something's in the works, I think as much as possible when you're considering whether it's independent living, skilled, assisted, or whatever it is, that you have the resident council or some resident subcommittee that kind of gets engaged in that and has, quote unquote, some ownership in the discussions, and that you've got to get to some extent you're building up a cheerleader crew anyway, so it's even better from the outcome standpoint to have somebody else sell it for you. But when it happens, and it's already happened, quote unquote, that's when they begin to get a little squirrely about it. And it's not that they usually are going to say, hey, this was not a great idea. It's more about, what did we have to give up, or what are we sacrificing? What were the other options on the table, for utilization of these capital funds, those types of things. So that's an area I would just think is important to share. And these are coming from direct perspectives from residents that I see statewide. So they're not my thoughts, if you will. Gain insight into context when you create other contracts, and when some of you have 1, some of you have 6, 7, 8. I think the only thing they want to understand is they want to be able to help sell the community, both internally and externally. And so the ability for them to understand what the nuances are between some of these contract elements is important to them in that standpoint. I think, without them going out and finding it on their own accord, if there's a way for you to give how your community is comparing to others, that's a great place to be, because they are going out and getting it anyway. The ability for you to give them something that does the same thing is going to give them context, and otherwise they're going to create the context on their own. And so, you have it, so it should better come from you, because you have the narrative and the rationale behind some of the reporting mechanisms. I think, again, the board, and this is separate from whether a resident was on it or not, is, and some of you obviously have stellar boards. Not saying you don't. I think in some cases they feel like some people, and this is no matter what board we're talking about. It could be a not-for-profit board. I'm talking any organization. Do you have the right people to meet the needs of the community? And from whether it's skill set standpoint, an understanding of the marketplace, I think in some cases they feel like maybe that there's not whether it's true or not is a different issue, but as much as you could convey from a provider management standpoint on how you go out and find board members and what you're looking for and how you vet them out is important to them, because that's the people that are making the decisions ultimately, work in collaboration with the CEOs. So I think it's more that you can share of how you go about that process, that the better off you are. Again, it all comes down to transparency. I think they clearly understand there are certain things that are off limits. They do understand that. And so, but I think, most cases, if you can give them something to address why they're asking the question, or understand where their questioning is actually coming from, and dig a little deeper. Sometimes the question in terms of how they ask it and what they're asking is not actually what they're seeking. So trying to do that next step and say, oh, I can help you with this. I know what you're actually trying to get to, and trying to make that determination. I think it's just basic communication in that standpoint. And don't always look at it from who the messenger is. It could be Joe, but just making sure that you've got some type of response, and that they want to be listened to. Ultimately, that's what all of us want, is they got a hearing, or something. I'm being heard, and they will respect in many cases when you're not able to accommodate the request. But if they feel like they're not being heard, that's where the problems start to create. So I do again appreciate you having me here. These are the key points I shared earlier. They care. They are more informed more than ever, and they want to make sure that the model survives. So that's important. So hopefully we all remember that. Any questions that we might have? I know we're walking into the lunch hour. Okay. All right. I really appreciate it very much. Thank you to the Leading Age for the ability for flight career, certainly our organizations to work together. And I think from a policy standpoint, we've all gotten some things together that we might not have gotten otherwise, or certainly had an easier path to get there for sure. And we appreciate that and we respect that very much. So thank you.